It's showtime. Damn it, wrong costume. The Incredibles is one of the most beloved movies to ever come out of Pixar. Many people to this day consider it their best film, even after 20 years. Holy shit, I'm getting old. My favorite Pixar movies are the Cars films. I've watched them a concerning amount of times. But The Incredibles and its sequel aren't that far behind. Much like Cars, I also watched the absolute hell out of them. And, much like Cars, I also had a very similar experience with the DVD for the first film. I was scrolling through the previews one day and came across this ad.
Rated T for teen.
Super strength. Super speed. Invisibility. Elasticity. These are your powers. The only way to survive being the Incredibles is to truly be incredible. Disney presents a Pixar film, The Incredibles video game, available now.
Much like the Cars video game, I searched and searched for a copy of the game, but could never find one since it was on old-ass hardware I didn't own. I eventually was able to find a PS2 and a copy of the game, but unlike Cars, which I played the whole way through and came to really enjoy, I quit The Incredibles after a few levels. I don't remember why though, so I recently decided to give the game a second chance and finally beat it, along with trying out its sequel, Incredibles: Rise of the Underminer, which resolves the cliffhanger at the end of the first movie over a decade before Incredibles 2 did. Both games were developed by Heavy Iron Studios, best known for their work on SpongeBob SquarePants, Battle for Bikini Bottom, and the SpongeBob movie game. So I have reasonably high hopes to expect both to be good. But then again, I quit it only a few levels in, so it might not be. Better play the game to find out. The gameplay for The Incredibles is exactly what you'd expect. The bulk of the game is a linear 3D platformer where the player goes from point A to point B while solving puzzles and beating up enemies. The game begins 15 years in the past, where we get to play as Mr. Incredible and Elastigirl in their prime. Their basic moveset is very similar, but they still have a bunch of different moves corresponding to their superpowers that set them apart from each other. Bob's moveset consists of him lifting objects and dealing hard blows to enemies, while Helen's moves have her contorting her body shape. The two can also fill up a meter that allows them to do their Incredimoves, which could help the player knock out a larger number of enemies. It's a pretty solid setup for an Incredibles game. The first 3 levels consist of Bob stopping a bank robbery staged by Bon Voyage, Elastigirl finishing off the rest of his henchmen, and Bob riding with Buddy through the city for a little while, before eventually landing on a city rooftop and finishing off Bon Voyage once and for all. These levels are a very solid start to the game. I had a really fun time with them, although I think the boss fight with Bon Voyage might have gone on a little too long. He has this very long attack cycle before you could hit him, and I think it could have been shortened just a little bit, because it makes the fight feel kind of boring by the end. But besides that, yeah, this game has been pretty solid so far. If it keeps up this momentum, we could have a winner on our hands. However, the game then decided to exceed all my expectations for it, and not do that. Following the boss fight with Bon Voyage, the game jumps forward 15 years later, and while I wouldn't say the game nosedives in quality, there's still definitely a bit of a drop-off. The next level has Bob and Lucius rescuing some citizens from a burning building, although unlike the movie, the fire is caused by a gang walking around with massive flamethrowers, and they are a pain in the ass to deal with. Unlike other levels, there isn't much for Bob to throw towards his enemies, so the only way to take them out is to attack directly, but since they have flamethrowers, you are most likely going to take a massive amount of damage trying to kill these guys. Otherwise, it's another solid level, but the next one, not so much. It's a level where you have to play as Dash and try to make it to school. Dash's gameplay is significantly different from his parents'. Instead of being a platformer beat-em-up hybrid, his stages are auto-runners where the player has to get to the goal while avoiding obstacles. Basically, imagine the Mach speed sections from Sonic 06. If they were even worse. Dash goes way too fast. So fast that even though I could see the obstacles in front of me, there isn't enough time to slow down or react. And even if there is, the only way to slow him down is to push down on the analog stick and just pray. Because getting hit once is an insta-kill. These stages suck. But thankfully, we return to Bob after Dash's stage, and it's also bad. The next few levels with Bob have the exact same problem as his last level, where Bob has to get directly next to enemies to attack them, but the enemies have weapons that they could use to attack you without getting close. They also introduce these sections to levels where Bob takes control of a turret and has to destroy one or a few targets while fighting off enemies. These sections are absolutely terrible. There's too much happening on screen, it's hard to focus on all these enemies at once while also trying to destroy the target the game wants you to, and as a result, I died a lot during these parts of the game. I don't even know how I got past them. I guess I just got lucky. But then the game reaches the point of no return. The boss fight with the Omnidroid. Where do I even start? Not only do your attacks barely do any damage to it while its attacks do a ton, not only are most of its attacks super hard to avoid, but you also have to do this for 3 phases, each of which are as long as the boss fight against Bon Voyage, and I already said that fight went on a little too long. But do you want to know what the worst part is? If you die during this fight, you have to start all the way from the beginning. Well, that was complete garbage, but it can't get any worse, right? After that fight, the game isn't nearly that bad. See? But it's still not good though. Oh. The next few levels have Bob return to Syndrome's Island, where he then fights the Omnidroid again, and I have to make an exception to what I said a moment ago, this is even worse than the original. Following that, Bob heads into Syndrome's base for the next level, gets caught, and we finally get to play as Helen for the first time since the second level. I found her stages to be more enjoyable than Bob's, since she can actually attack and throw enemies from a distance. There's a couple more levels with Dash, one in the style of the last one, and another where he rides in one of Violet's force fields. The first one isn't that fun, but the one with Violet I found to be pretty enjoyable, even if it can be easy to get lost in the level. We also have our first and only level where we get to play as Violet, and it's easy to see why there's only one of these stages. Violet's gameplay is stealth-based. She needs to go invisible in order to get past guards and make it to the end of the stage. She can't attack enemies, and getting caught is an instant game over. Sounds like a solid gameplay style for Violet, but it just doesn't work. The AI for the guards is either unfair and hyper-aware of everything going on around it, or stupid and not able to see jack shit. After the kids meet up with their parents, we have 2 final levels with Helen and Bob respectively as they head through Syndrome's base in order to launch a rocket to take them back home. Not much to comment on, just more of the same. With that, it's finally time for the final fight with the Omnidroid. While I was pretty harsh on the first 2 fights, I actually found this one to be pretty solid. It doesn't pull any unfair punches like the last 2, and the phases for the fight last a reasonable amount of time. Defeat the Omnidroid and we finish the Incredibles. It's not a terrible game, but it definitely feels cheap and rushed out the door. Probably because Heavy Iron was developing 2 different games in the same year. If they had put more resources into it, I think it could have been a great game. Like I said, I think it started out very promising with those first 3 levels, but they just didn't have the dev time to polish the game and get it to its highest potential. I'd only, and I mean only, recommend this to the biggest Incredibles fan on the planet, and nobody else. I guess I should move on to Rise of the Underminer now, but this game isn't giving me much hope for it. Much like Incredibles 2, Rise of the Underminer takes place immediately after the first film. The Underminer begins attacking the city, and it's up to our heroes to stop him. The family splits up. Helen and the kids go to fight on the surface and stop the destruction of the Underminer's drills, while Bob and Frozone go underground to defeat the Underminer himself. Now, unlike the first game, which was a cross between a beat-em-up and 3D platformer, this game is just a straight-up brawler. It consists of exactly what you'd expect from the genre: go through levels, beat up as many enemies as possible, and solve some very basic puzzles. Despite being called The Incredibles: Rise of the Underminer, you don't actually get to play as the full family like the last game, or the full family minus Jack. Instead, you can only play as Mr. Incredible and Frozone. Bob plays exactly the same as he did in the last game. The only difference is that when he's lifting heavy objects, the player has to hold the Y button, compared to Incredibles 1, where you had to mash it. Whoa! Frozone is the new kid in town here, and he plays very differently compared to Bob, and in some areas is actually more fun to play as. His moves, as you'd expect, have him use his ice powers to freeze enemies, build things like bridges to clear gaps, and perform a glide for a brief period of time that can even hurt enemies. The Incredi-moves from the last game have been completely removed, and in their place are the brand new Super Moves, which are basically just a screen nuke. It sounds like a very basic and bland game at first, but it's actually surprisingly pretty fun. Much like the first game, the characters control smoothly, it's super satisfying to beat up enemies, and while it's pretty easy for the most part, it's not mind-numbingly easy. And there are even some times towards the end of the game where it gives you a pretty solid challenge.
Watch out! It's raining boulders! Keep moving! Whoa! Cars too?
The bulk of the game takes place underground. There are only 2 times where we spend time on the surface, which are the first level and the last level. Now, this does sound like a problem with the game at first. You know, all the levels will basically just be dirt and machine. But there are also snow levels, levels taking place in reactors, laboratories, and so on and so forth. The developers were able to do a very good job making the levels stand out from each other for how limited they were in locations they could use. One thing that I also really like, and forgot to even mention when talking about the first game, was the soundtrack. The soundtrack for both games sounds straight out of the movies, and that's because Michael Giacchino, composer for both Incredibles movies, worked on them. I don't know if I'm going to play any of the music in the games here since they contain some motifs from the movie, and I don't want to get a copyright claim, but I can confirm they sound really good. The only complaint I have with the music for both games isn't really related to the music itself, but that, similar to Sonic Unleashed and its Werehog stages, it keeps playing the exact same music whenever any action starts to happen. Basically, replace this with this. And that's Incredibles: Rise of the Underminer. And to my surprise, I actually enjoyed it a lot more than the first Incredibles game. It's not some slept-on masterpiece. At most, I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. But unlike the first game, I'd recommend it to those who want a decent Incredibles game. Well, that was disappointing. The Incredibles is one of Pixar's best movies, and the sequel, while worse than the first, I still consider to be a decent movie. So it sucks that the video game adaptations just couldn't meet the same quality. Like I said, I really do think that had more resources and dev time been put into these games, they could have ended up a lot better. But since these are licensed games made to tie into movies, they were obviously never going to do that. And while it might have gotten the games out on time, in the long term, it's caused them to have no relevance or legacy nowadays. People still talk about the Cars video games. People still talk about the Toy Story video games. Nobody talks about the Incredibles video games. To end the video on a more positive note, yeah, I got nothing.